Fumio Kishida and Joe Biden met at a historic time in US-Japan ties as they build it, and at a time when those ties have never been closer. Is China the reason why?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, Japan's really come into its own ever since the United States unfortunately left the Trans-Pacific Partnership and Japan took leadership of it. It's really assumed much more of a leadership role within free Asia. And now we see as the PRC threat emerges and grows, and Japan worries we may not be there forever, although we're not leaving Asia anytime soon, we being the United States. It's decided to somewhat take matters into its own hand and effectively double its defense spending in its latest budget from 1 to 2%, coming close to the NATO threshold of 2% of GDP on defense. So North Korea is an issue, some other things, but really the PRC, a potential attack on Taiwan, or a seizure of the Senkaku Islands, which inconveniently Taipei itself claims, the real reasons. Mainland China is behind Japan's reason for its increase in its defense budget, no doubt.
Kishida has framed this point in time, which he's saying is a significant change in the US-Japan relationship.
I don't really see it so much as a change. I see it more of an evolution. I think Japan's taking more responsibility. It wants to not be seen as a free rider, as some US allies are accused. And the alliance itself is also evolving and adapting. When the defense and foreign ministers met in the 2+2 meetings on Thursday, they discussed things like cyber, outer space, and also a more mobile and nimble U.S. forces in Japan, especially around southern islands of Japan, which would be nearer any Taiwan contingency should it ever come to pass. So I really see it as an evolution and an adaptation and growth of the alliance and the relationship between the two countries.
And what did Kishida want to achieve from this trip, and did he achieve it?
Well, I'll start with the end. He definitely achieved it. And the Japanese public is pretty much on board with the increase in defense armaments, an increase and a tougher line on Beijing. The question is, how are you going to pay for it? And he has proposed to pay for it with tax money. And I don't know if that's going to go over so well. So I think he wants to show that the U.S. is behind him on this, and standing in Washington counts for a lot back in Japan with the public, members of the Diet, and voters. So the fact that Joe Biden is strongly behind Kishida on his bold plans and stands with it and endorses it will help him sell the plan at home and get the money for it. And remember, Kishida's popularity is down due to his party's connection with the Unification Church in the wake of the late Shinzo Abe's assassination.
How does Taiwan play into that?
Well, they see the PRC increasing its defense, North Korea shooting off missiles every day or so. And again, as we saw during the Trump years, there could always be the suspicion that Japan's not pulling its weight among certain Americans. So the more they can do to show that they are doing everything they can, just like Taiwan increasing its conscription to 1 year is going to help sell the Taiwan case in Washington, I think just makes Japan even a more sympathetic case than it already is in Washington. And Taiwan, if South Korea were to fall to North Korea, that's terrible. But I think it would be basically limited to the Korean Peninsula. If Taiwan were to ever be seized by the PRC, it would basically signal the end of the U.S. order in Asia, to which Japan has hitched its ride. So if Taiwan were to fall to the PRC, it would mean the end of the U.S. and Asia, either because we chose not to fight or we fought and lost. Either way, Japan's in a bad way. Plus, again, the PRC's attempts to interfere with and seize the Senkaku Islands. So Japan has a lot more at stake when it comes to the PRC than when, say, it has on the Korean Peninsula.
That would be why Biden is insistent on building alliances. Japan is too. The Washington meeting capped a tour to G7 leaders. How important is it for Japan to seek allies beyond the US? How do you think G7 would be shaped under Japan's leadership this year?
Well, again, when we're talking about a potential end to the U.S. order in Asia, I don't see this happening anytime soon. I do not foresee an imminent invasion of Taiwan. I've been worried about Taiwan's status for 25 years. I'm thinking medium to long term, and I do applaud President Biden for working as much as possible through alliances, force multipliers for good and U.S. values in the region. And Japan, as leader of the G7 this year, Japan has to go around working with these other nations. And I know on this tour of the world, Kishida stopped in every G7 country except Germany. And I think with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, autocracy, terror, and invasion and terrible things cannot be localized anymore. It's a global issue. So by focusing on what Russia's doing in Ukraine, I think Kishida can help Europeans understand the plight that certain East Asian democracies like Japan face against mainland China and North Korea. And under Japan's leadership, I think that the G7 will be very focused on democracy, the rights of smaller state, maritime issues, and cast a very careful, skeptical eye on both Beijing and Pyongyang, perhaps more so than if it were under any European powers jurisdiction this year.
Along with mentioning peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, the joint statement between Kishida and Joe Biden also mentioned the strengthening the trilateral security partnership with South Korea. How important is South Korea to security in Asia?
Very important. It's a leading democracy and major economy. And South Korean conservatives tend to favor Japan, and South Korean liberals tend to pull away from Japan. So Yoon Suk-yeol, the incumbent South Korean conservative president, ran on a platform of closer cooperation with Japan. Already there have been naval reviews, talk of intelligence sharing, and none of the Japan bashing in his government you've seen in previous administrations. I don't think South Korea would directly involve itself in any kind of Taiwan contingency. But as we saw in Yoon's own Indo-Pacific policy released a few weeks ago, finally a South Korean government is looking beyond just the peninsula and talking about universal values, human rights, freedom of navigation, peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, taking an interest in the Pacific Islands.
And why has South Korea made that shift now?
I think that the major reason was until 2016, South Korea basically tried to have it both ways. They went to mainland China for economics and the US for security. And due to a shared hatred with Japan, many South Koreans had at least a neutral, somewhat positive view of mainland China. But then when Beijing mercilessly punished South Korean companies and consumers for Seoul's decision to host a US anti-missile shield on a golf course south of Seoul, known as THAAD, Terminal High Aerial Altitude Defense, that has totally turned the South Korean public against Beijing, and it stayed that way through other issues of environment, lack of internet freedom, crackdown on Hong Kong, Xinjiang, cultural appropriation issues that we've seen with kimchi and humbug in the Olympics. So right now, most South Koreans have a more negative view of the PRC than they do of Japan, if you can believe it. So the South Korean public has really come a long way to viewing mainland China very negatively, and in turn, the US very favorably. This helped in a small part usher in Yoon Suk-yeol's government last year in the presidential election, and has made it much easier for him to sell some kind of trilateral cooperation between South Korea, Japan, and the United States.
And yet when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in August, after that, when she traveled to South Korea, Yoon Suk-yeol didn't see her.
Very unfortunate. I was very disappointed by that. And he got a lot of pushback from his own citizens. A lot of people criticized him for not meeting her. Plus, again, his own Indo-Pacific policy that came out a few weeks ago, he still talked about Beijing as a partner along with Japan and other Asian countries. So it seems like the government and Yoon, even himself, is a little bit behind the South Korean public, but at least he's going in the right direction.
Speaking about changing views in South Korea, the president has even made remarks about South Korea building its own nuclear arsenal. Now, this would be a complete shift.
First of all, I don't think it's going to happen, but the words are significant in that they again signal the shift in the South Korean public. Surveys I've seen suggest 70% of South Koreans want their own nukes, and a majority want the US to redeploy our nukes that we took out in 1991. And this shows now that North Korea is talking about perhaps a tactical nuclear strike in the South to immobilize US forces, and a long-term fear of the PRC, even post-DPRK, you've seen this uptick in South Korean appetite for its own nukes. It's kind of refreshing in a way, because at least they realize who the true enemy is. But we don't want any extra nukes in the region. There are already too many. So we're against proliferation, but I don't think Biden's going to look too favorably on his suggestion that he may get his own nukes. I know he's looking for some kind of nuclear sharing agreement like there is in NATO, or at least some exercises with nukes, which is not going to happen. I hear they're only going to have some tabletop exercises sometime this year.